In 1965, a tiny island got kicked out of its own country. No army worth mentioning. No oil, no coal, not even enough fresh water of its own. Its own founding prime minister once called the idea of it surviving on its own a political, economic, and geographical absurdity. 60 years later, that same island has one of the highest incomes per person on Earth. So what actually happened in between? This isn't a story about luck, and it's not really a story about magic either. It's the story of 5 deliberate choices made by people who had almost nothing else to work with: a government, a location, a strategy for chasing the world's money, a housing policy that turned renters into owners, and a bet on people because people were the only resource the country actually had. We'll get into who made these choices, what circumstances forced their hand, and how a few well-timed world events helped along the way. By the end, you'll know exactly what Singapore's so-called secret sauce actually is and whether any other country could copy it. Let's start with the person most people associate with Singapore's rise: Lee Kuan Yew, the country's first prime minister. But the interesting part isn't really Lee Kuan Yew the man. It's the system he built around himself. Most governments run on some mix of politics and connections. Lee's government ran, almost aggressively, on competence. Civil servants got promoted for doing their jobs well, not for how long they'd been there or who they knew. And to keep talented people from just going to the private sector instead, the government paid its top officials real money, salaries that could actually compete. That sounds simple. It's not. Most countries that try this get captured by corruption within a generation. Singapore built the opposite reputation, backed by a dedicated anti-corruption agency, the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, that investigates cases in both government and business with real prosecutorial teeth. As of the most recent international ranking, released in 2026, Singapore scored 84 out of 100 on the world's leading corruption index, making it the 3rd least corrupt country on Earth and the single least corrupt country in the whole Asia-Pacific region. That's not a coincidence. It's a system with real enforcement behind it, and it let the government do something most democracies struggle to do: plan for the very long term. Singapore's Urban Planning Authority routinely maps out projects 50 years into the future. Try getting a government to commit to anything 50 years out when the people in charge might lose their jobs in 4. Here's the honest complication, and we'll come back to it properly near the end. The same continuity that made this long-term planning possible is also because one political party has governed Singapore continuously since 1959. That's a real trade-off, not a footnote, but it's also genuinely part of why the rest of this list was even possible. Which brings us to what that competent, long-term thinking government actually did with the tiny, resourceless island it was handed. Reason 2: they turned a location with nothing on it into a place the world literally has to pass through. Singapore has almost no natural resources and barely any land. But it sits directly on the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest shipping corridors on the planet, a position it's held since a British trader named Stamford Raffles set up a trading post there back in 1819. Most countries in that position would just collect the traffic passing through and call it a day. Singapore didn't. It scrapped import taxes, built one of the busiest transshipment ports in the world, and in 1981 opened Changi Airport specifically to lock in its position as a logistics and aviation hub, not just a shipping one. Think about what that actually means. If you're a company trying to reach Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Asia all at once, Singapore isn't just a convenient stop. It's often the only stop that makes sense. Today it ranks just behind Shanghai for port traffic, on an island small enough to walk across in a day. That kind of connectivity doesn't just move cargo, it moves headquarters. Thousands of multinational companies now base their entire regional operations in Singapore, precisely because a location that easy to reach is also easy to run a region from. That's a pattern that's going to show up again and again in this video. Singapore didn't get handed an advantage. It built one, deliberately, out of the one thing it actually had. And location alone doesn't build an economy. What you do with the ships once they stop there does, which is where the government's next move comes in. Reason 3. Instead of protecting local businesses from foreign competition, which is what most newly independent countries did at the time, Singapore did almost the opposite. It went out and aggressively recruited foreign companies to set up shop. In 1961, Singapore's first finance minister, Goh Keng Swee, founded a new agency called the Economic Development Board, or the EDB, with one job: get multinational companies to build factories in Singapore. Not to protect what already existed, but to bring in what didn't exist yet. The early wins were small, a tax break for Shell in 1961. But the real breakthrough came in 1968, when the American company Texas Instruments started making semiconductors, high-tech electronics components, on the island. Within a couple of years, Fairchild, Hewlett-Packard, and General Electric all followed. By 2001, foreign companies were responsible for 75% of everything Singapore manufactured for export. And crucially, the strategy never sat still. Garments and toys in the 60s, precision electronics and hard drives in the 70s and 80s, biomedical science in the 2000s, advanced semiconductors today, with Singapore now actively positioning itself as a safe alternative manufacturing base as trade tensions between the US and China get more complicated. Here's the world events part of this reason. None of this happens without the timing. Western manufacturers in the 60s and 70s wanted politically stable, non-communist bases in Asia during the Cold War. Singapore showed up at exactly the right moment, offering exactly that. Circumstance opened the door. The Economic Development Board is what walked through it, decade after decade, industry after industry. And Singapore kept adapting every time the world threw something new at it. The 1973 oil crisis forced the country to stop leaning so hard on cheap, labor-intensive manufacturing and push harder into higher-value industries. The 1997 Asian financial crisis hit most of the region hard, but Singapore came through it in comparatively good shape, which only reinforced its reputation as the region's safe financial base. And the 2008 global financial crisis triggered another deliberate pivot, this time toward advanced services like finance and logistics, so the economy wasn't so dependent on exports alone. Every one of these was a shock nobody planned for. Every time, the same playbook, adapt fast, keep the long-term plan intact, kept working. So far, we've covered a government that couldn't be bought, and a country that turned its location and its economic policy into permanent advantages. But none of that explains why ordinary Singaporeans actually bought into the whole project. For that, we need to talk about housing. Reason 4. The government turned every citizen into a literal financial stakeholder in the country's success. Back at independence, most people in Singapore lived in overcrowded shophouses or informal settlements called kampangs. In 1960, the government set up the Housing and Development Board, or HDB, to build affordable housing at scale. That part isn't unusual. Plenty of countries built public housing. The genuinely clever move came in 1968. Singapore already had a mandatory retirement savings program called the Central Provident Fund, or CPF, money automatically deducted from every paycheck. In 1968, the government said, you can use that retirement money to buy your government-built flat instead of just saving it. Demand didn't just go up. It went from 3,000 applications to 70,000 in a single year. The effect compounds. Home ownership in Singapore went from 29% of households in 1970 to roughly 90% today, including nearly 9 in 10 households in the poorest fifth of the population. That's one of the highest homeownership rates anywhere in the world. Why does that matter beyond just having a roof? When almost everyone owns property, almost everyone has a direct financial reason to want the country to keep succeeding. Rising property values aren't an abstract economic statistic, they're personal. It also meant the government could recycle those retirement savings into national investment funds, effectively turning citizens' own money into capital for the country's next moves. Some of that capital flows through two sovereign wealth funds, TMAHSEC and GIC, which invest it globally on the country's behalf. Most countries treat public housing as a cost. Singapore treated it as the mechanism that got everyone rowing in the same direction. Which leaves one more piece of the puzzle. None of this works without the right people to do the actual rowing. Reason 5, and the one Lee Kuan Yew himself pointed to as the real foundation. With no natural resources at all, the only asset Singapore actually had was its people. So the government built an education system designed to find and develop talent as early and as efficiently as possible, regardless of family income. And it's genuinely efficient, not just well-funded. Singapore spends only about 3% of its GDP on education, less than Malaysia, less than Indonesia, well below the average for developed countries. And yet Singaporean students routinely rank at or near the very top of the world in math, reading, and science. Part of how? A national exam around age 12, called the PSLE, sorts students toward academic, technical, or vocational paths based on ability. I want to be honest with you here. That's genuinely controversial, even inside Singapore. Sorting 12-year-olds by test performance can lock an advantage or disadvantage very young. It's not a purely happy story, and we shouldn't pretend it is. But even critics of the system tend to agree on one thing. It found talent in places that pure privilege-based systems miss. A kid from a poor family who tested well got the same shot at a top school as a kid from a wealthy one. The other piece was language. Rather than favoring the mother tongue of any one of Singapore's major ethnic communities, the government made English the working language of government, business, and education. That did two things at once. It avoided handing one ethnic group a built-in advantage over the others, and it made the entire workforce immediately legible to foreign investors from day one, no translation required. Put those 5 reasons together, and here's what you get. A government that couldn't be bought, sitting on a location it turned into a choke point, aggressively courting the capital and companies of the world, backed by citizens who were financially invested in the outcome, staffed by a population the country had deliberately, efficiently developed. That's the actual secret sauce, not one trick. 5, compounding on each other for 60 years. Before we wrap up, it's worth being honest about what this success didn't come with. Singapore has been governed by the same political party continuously since 1959. Press freedom ranks low globally, 123rd out of 180 countries as of 2026, and a law called POFMA gives a government minister the power to order corrections or takedowns of online content. Wealth inequality has also been stubborn. The wealthiest 1% of Singaporeans own roughly a fifth of the country's total wealth, largely unchanged over the past 30 years, even as income inequality has actually improved. And yet, public trust in the government remains genuinely high, well above the global average in recent surveys. This isn't a population secretly seething under the surface. It's a trade-off most Singaporeans appear to have made consciously. Less political noise, in exchange for the stability that let those 5 reasons run uninterrupted for 6 decades. So, is Singapore's secret sauce copyable? Partly. Other countries can copy meritocratic hiring or export-focused economic policy or housing tied to savings. Those are just policy choices. Copying one ingredient rarely works on its own. Plenty of countries have tried a single piece of this playbook and gotten mixed results. What's much harder to copy is the combination, running consistently, for 60 straight years, under one government that never got voted out mid-plan. Singapore didn't get lucky once. It made the same kind of hard, unpopular, long-term choice 5 different times in 5 different areas, and then it kept making variations of that same choice for 6 decades straight. That consistency, more than any single policy, might be the real secret sauce. So that's the story. A government that couldn't be bought, a location turned into leverage, a country that went hunting for the world's capital instead of hiding from it, citizens with real skin in the game, and a population developed like the country's only natural resource, because it was. If you want to see which of these 5 reasons other countries have actually tried to copy, and where it worked, let me know in the comments. That might be the next video.